August 9th, 1945. The Manchurian summer hung heavy over the fortified positions along the Soviet-Manchukuo border. Japanese soldiers of the Kwantung Army huddled in concrete bunkers that had taken years to construct, their confidence buttressed by walls 3 feet thick, and the belief that their defensive lines were impregnable. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the scent of sun-baked earth and the nervous sweat of men who sensed something terrible approaching but could not yet see it. In the pre-dawn darkness, the horizon flickered with distant flashes that might have been heat lightning, except the thunder that followed came in organized waves, rhythmic and purposeful. Artillery, Soviet artillery. And then, beneath the concussive rhythm of the bombardment, a new sound emerged, a mechanical growling that seemed to come from everywhere at once, growing louder with each passing moment. Tank engines, hundreds of tank engines. The Japanese defenders had prepared for many contingencies, but they were utterly unprepared for what was about to roll over them. The T-34 medium tank that led the Soviet advance represented more than just a weapon. It embodied a philosophy of warfare that had been forged in the desperate fighting on the Eastern Front, refined through years of brutal combat against the Wehrmacht, and now unleashed against an enemy who had never faced anything remotely comparable. The soldiers of the Kwantung Army, Japan's premier fighting force in continental Asia, had built their defensive doctrine around experiences fighting Chinese forces equipped with obsolete armor and limited mechanized capabilities. They had faced Soviet forces in border skirmishes during the late 1930s, but those encounters had featured older tanks, lighter machines that Japanese anti-tank weapons could handle. What approached them now in the summer of 1945 was something entirely different, a generation ahead in design, proven in the most savage armor battles in human history, and operated by crews who had learned their craft in a school of warfare that made the Pacific theater seem almost genteel by comparison. The defensive positions stretched for hundreds of miles, a network of bunkers, trenches, and fortifications that the Japanese command believed could hold against any assault. Engineers had spent years selecting positions, pouring concrete, emplacing guns, creating interlocking fields of fire. The fortifications along the Manchurian border represented a significant investment of resources and effort. Underground passages connected key positions. Ammunition dumps were carefully concealed and protected. Water supplies were secured. Medical facilities were dug deep into hillsides. On paper, on maps studied in staff meetings in Helsinki and Tokyo, these defenses looked formidable. They had been designed based on lessons learned from previous wars, from studies of European fortification systems, from analysis of defensive warfare as understood by Japanese military doctrine. But that doctrine had a fatal blind spot. It had not accounted for the possibility of facing an enemy with overwhelming armored superiority operating with the kind of coordination and combined arms expertise that the Red Army had developed fighting the Germans. The T-34 had been born from the Soviet Union's recognition, achieved at terrible cost during the early months of the war against Germany, that their existing tank designs were inadequate. When German panzers rolled into Soviet territory in June of 1941, they initially achieved shocking success against Soviet armor that was either obsolete or poorly deployed. But even in those dark early months, one Soviet tank stood out. The T-34, which had only recently entered production, proved capable of holding its own against German panzers and even superior to many of them. The tank's genesis lay in the late 1930s, when Soviet designers, learning from experience in the Spanish Civil War and studying trends in armor development, began work on a new medium tank that would incorporate the most advanced features available. The result was a machine that combined 3 crucial elements in a way that no other tank of the era matched: firepower, armor protection, and mobility. The main armament consisted of a 76.2mm gun, designated the F-34, that could fire a 17-pound armor-piercing round at a muzzle velocity of 2,168 feet per second. To appreciate the significance of this weapon, consider that most Japanese tanks in Manchuria mounted guns of 37mm or, in their heaviest tanks, 47mm. The penetrative power difference was not incremental but categorical. The T-34's gun could punch through Japanese tank armor at ranges where Japanese guns could not even reach the Soviet machines. When that 76mm round struck a target, It carried kinetic energy sufficient to defeat armor 3 inches thick at 1,000 yards. Japanese tanks typically featured armor less than 2 inches thick at their strongest points. The mathematical reality was brutal and simple. The T-34 could engage and destroy any Japanese armored vehicle in the theater with virtual impunity, while Japanese tanks posed almost no threat to the Soviet machine unless they achieved hits at point-blank range on vulnerable spots. But the gun was merely one element of the T-34's revolutionary design. The armor configuration represented a conceptual breakthrough that German engineers would study with grudging admiration and eventually imitate. Soviet designers had sloped the armor at aggressive angles, creating surfaces that were much more effective than their nominal thickness suggested. The front hull armor measured 45 millimeters thick, but because it was angled at 60 degrees from vertical, an incoming projectile had to penetrate the equivalent of 90 millimeters of perpendicular armor. This sloping provided protection equivalent to much thicker vertical plates while saving weight. The effect was multiplicative. Not only did the angle increase the effective thickness, it also dramatically increased the likelihood that projectiles would ricocheate rather than penetrate. Japanese anti-tank weapons, designed to defeat lightly armored vehicles and fortifications, simply bounced off the T-34's glacis plate like hailstones off a tin roof. Gunners in concrete bunkers, firing their Type 1 47mm anti-tank guns at approaching T-34 seconds, watched in horror as round after round sparked harmlessly off the sloped armor, the tanks advancing inexorably despite taking multiple direct hits. The Christie suspension system that the T-34 inherited from American designer J. Walter Christie gave the tank mobility that astonished observers. Large road wheels, each nearly 3 feet in diameter, provided excellent ground contact and distributed the tank's weight efficiently. Wide tracks measuring nearly 20 inches across prevented the 30-ton vehicle from sinking into soft ground that would have immobilized heavier machines with narrower tracks. The V2 diesel engine, a 12-cylinder power plant producing 500 horsepower, gave the T-34 a power-to-weight ratio that translated into surprising speed for such a heavily armored and armed vehicle. Maximum road speed exceeded 30 miles per hour, and the tank could maintain reasonable pace across rough terrain where other vehicles bogged down. Japanese defenders, accustomed to slower, more methodical advances, found themselves unable to adjust fire rapidly enough to track T-34 seconds that sometimes appeared, fired, and disappeared behind terrain features before effective countermeasures could be organized. The diesel engine provided advantages beyond mere power output. Diesel fuel was less volatile than gasoline, reducing the likelihood of catastrophic fires when the tank was hit. The engine's fuel efficiency gave the T-34 an operational range exceeding 280 miles on internal fuel, allowing sustained operations without frequent refueling stops. This operational endurance proved crucial in Manchuria, where supply lines stretched across vast distances and rapid exploitation of breakthroughs depended on tanks being able to advance deep into enemy territory without pause. The engine's reliability, forged through years of combat experience and iterative improvement, meant that Soviet tank units could maintain high operational readiness rates, even under the demanding conditions of rapid mobile warfare. The design philosophy behind the T-34 reflected Soviet industrial realities and tactical doctrine in ways that made it ideally suited for large-scale mechanized warfare. The tank was designed for mass production by a workforce that might include many unskilled or semi-skilled workers. Components were rugged and simple where possible. Tolerances were loose compared to German tanks, which made the T-34 easier to manufacture but also easier to repair in field conditions. Maintenance could be performed by crew members with basic mechanical skills and simple tools. This producibility meant that Soviet factories could manufacture T-34 seconds in enormous quantities. By 1945, Soviet industry had produced tens of thousands of T-34 seconds in various models. The scale of production meant that losses, even heavy losses, could be replaced. For the Manchurian operation, the Soviets could commit over 1,200 tanks, knowing that this represented a sustainable expenditure of resources. The crews manning these tanks brought experience that Japanese soldiers could not match. Many Soviet tankers in Manchuria were veterans of the European theater, men who had fought in the great tank battles at Kursk, in the grinding advances through Ukraine and Belarus, in the assault on Berlin itself. They had faced German Tigers and Panthers, the most formidable tanks of the war, and had learned not just to survive but to prevail through superior tactics, better coordination with supporting arms, and the kind of aggressive audacity that comes from having survived previous encounters that should have been fatal. These men understood combined arms warfare at a level that the Kwantung Army, isolated in Manchuria and starved of modern equipment and realistic training, could not approach. Soviet doctrine emphasized coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power in a seamless flow of mutual support that overwhelmed defensive positions through multiple simultaneous pressures. When the Soviet offensive began in the early morning hours of August 9th, the scale and violence of the assault shocked Japanese defenders, who had convinced themselves that their positions were secure. The artillery preparation that preceded the tank assault exceeded anything Japanese forces in Manchuria had experienced. Soviet guns, from light field pieces to heavy siege artillery, systematically destroyed key positions, cut communications, and created gaps in the defensive line. The bombardment was not random harassment but precisely targeted fire, directed by forward observers, and based on detailed intelligence about Japanese positions. When the barrage lifted, the tanks rolled forward, not in tentative probes, but in massed waves that exploited every gap, every weak point, every moment of confusion among the defenders. The T-34s advanced in formation, maintaining coordination even across difficult terrain. Tank commanders communicated via radio, a seemingly basic capability that many Japanese units lacked entirely. This communication allowed Soviet units to respond dynamically to changing situations, to concentrate force at decisive points, to call for support when needed, to exploit success aggressively. Japanese defenders, their communications disrupted by the artillery bombardment and lacking equivalent radio networks, found themselves fighting in isolation, each position unaware of what was happening to neighboring units, unable to coordinate responses or call for reinforcement. The Soviet advance created pockets of resistance that could be bypassed and reduced later, rather than strong, continuous lines that would slow the momentum of the attack. Japanese anti-tank weapons proved woefully inadequate against the T-34s. The Type 147mm gun, the best anti-tank weapon widely available to Kwantung Army units, could penetrate only about 2 inches of armor at 500 yards when firing standard ammunition against perpendicular plate. Against the T-34's sloped armor, effective engagement range shrank to nearly point-blank distances, and even then only side or rear shots offered hope of penetration. Gunners who had trained extensively and possessed genuine skill found themselves impotent, watching rounds ricochet or shatter against armor that their weapons simply could not defeat. Some positions attempted to engage T-34s at ranges of 1,000 yards or more, expending ammunition uselessly while the Soviet tanks closed to effective firing range and systematically destroyed the gun positions with high explosive shells or machine gun fire. The psychological impact of facing invulnerable enemy armor cannot be overstated. Soldiers in defensive positions depend on the belief that their weapons can hurt the enemy, that courage and skill can influence outcomes. When Japanese troops saw their best anti-tank weapons failing repeatedly against the T-34s, when they watched tanks absorb multiple hits and continue advancing, morale collapsed in many units. The sound of tank engines became associated with inevitable defeat. Soldiers who might have fought tenaciously against infantry or against armor they believed they could destroy instead abandoned positions or surrendered when faced with T-34s that seemed immune to their weapons. Some units fought with desperate courage, attempting close-range attacks with magnetic mines or satchel charges, achieving occasional successes at terrible cost. But individual acts of heroism could not compensate for fundamental material inferiority. The terrain of Manchuria posed challenges that favored the defender in theory, but proved manageable for Soviet forces in practice. Rivers crossed the likely invasion routes, offering potential barriers if properly defended. Hills and ridges provided observation and firing positions. Forests offered concealment and complicated mechanized operations. Japanese planners had incorporated these terrain features into their defensive scheme, positioning forces to exploit natural advantages. But the Red Army had spent years developing doctrine for overcoming fortified positions and natural obstacles. Engineer units accompanied the advancing armor, carrying bridging equipment and mine-clearing tools. When bridges were destroyed, temporary replacements appeared with startling speed. When terrain channelized the advance, artillery and airstrikes suppressed positions covering the choke points, while tanks forced passage. The coordination between different arms allowed Soviet forces to maintain momentum even when encountering significant obstacles. The speed of the Soviet advance created cascading problems for Japanese commanders attempting to organize resistance. Defensive warfare depends on having time to move reserves to threatened sectors, to establish fallback positions, to organize counterattacks. The T-34s and accompanying mechanized infantry moved too fast for the Kwantung Army's response times. By the time reports reached headquarters and orders were issued, the situation had already changed dramatically. Reserve units moving toward yesterday's crisis point found Soviet forces already deep in their rear areas. Communication networks broke down as advancing Soviet units overran command posts and severed telephone lines. What Japanese staff officers needed was a coherent picture of the battlefield and hours to make decisions. What they got was fragmentary reports of disaster and minutes to respond before the situation deteriorated further. Soviet tactical aviation provided close support that Japanese forces could not counter effectively. Sturmovik ground attack aircraft worked in coordination with advancing tank units, striking targets identified by forward air controllers accompanying the ground forces. These aircraft attacked Japanese positions with bombs, rockets, and cannon fire, suppressing defenses and destroying vehicles and equipment. Japanese air units in Manchuria, depleted by years of attrition and starved of fuel and replacement aircraft, could mount only token resistance. The skies belonged to the Red Air Force, and that air superiority translated into devastating effectiveness for Soviet ground forces who could operate without significant fear of air attack while benefiting from comprehensive air support. The broader strategic situation made the tactical superiority of the T-34 even more decisive. Japan was already reeling from years of war, its industrial base damaged by American bombing, its navy destroyed, its army in China and Manchuria isolated and undersupplied. The Kwantung Army that faced the Soviet onslaught in August 1945 was a shadow of the force that had once been considered Japan's most elite formation. The best divisions had been transferred to other theaters. Equipment was obsolete or worn out. Training was inadequate. Morale was low. Soldiers knew that the empire was losing the war and questioned whether continued resistance served any purpose. Into this situation came Soviet forces that were at the peak of their capability, equipped with proven weapons, led by experienced commanders, and operating with the confidence that comes from an unbroken string of victories against the Wehrmacht. The scale of Soviet mechanization in the Manchurian operation dwarfed anything Japan could field. The 1,200 tanks committed to the campaign represented just one element of a mechanized force that included thousands of armored personnel carriers, self-propelled guns, trucks, and other vehicles. This mechanization allowed Soviet forces to sustain rapid advances over vast distances, moving faster than Japanese units could march, bringing supplies and reinforcements forward quickly enough to maintain momentum. Japanese forces, largely dependent on foot movement and horse-drawn transport, simply could not match the operational tempo that mechanization enabled. By the time Japanese units reached a position, Soviet forces had already passed through and were miles beyond. Individual encounters between T-34s and Japanese defensive positions followed a depressingly predictable pattern. Soviet tanks would approach hull down when possible, exposing only their turrets and presenting minimal target profiles. Japanese gunners would open fire, achieving hits that sparked harmlessly off the sloped armor. The T-34s would methodically identify and destroy each firing position, their gunners taking time to aim carefully, knowing that Japanese weapons posed minimal threat. High explosive shells would blast open bunkers. Machine gun fire would suppress infantry. Once resistance was eliminated or suppressed, the tanks would advance to the next position and repeat the process. Occasionally, a lucky shot or a close-range attack would disable or destroy a T-34, but such successes were rare and bought at terrible cost. For every Soviet tank knocked out, dozens of Japanese positions were obliterated. The campaign's brevity testified to the mismatch in capabilities. Soviet forces attacked on August 9th. By August 15, when Japan announced its surrender, Soviet mechanized units had advanced hundreds of miles, destroyed the coherence of Japanese defensive positions, and made clear that continued resistance was futile. In 1 week, the Kwantung Army, which had once dominated Manchuria, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The speed of the collapse was not primarily due to lack of courage among Japanese soldiers, but to the fundamental impossibility of defending successfully against an enemy with such overwhelming material superiority employed with tactical and operational competence. The technical superiority of the T-34 over Japanese armor was absolute and representative of broader disparities. Where Japanese tanks mounted guns of 37 or 47 millimeters, the T-34's 76 millimeter gun outranged and outpenetrated anything the Japanese could field. Where Japanese tanks featured thin vertical armor that even light anti-tank weapons could defeat, the T-34's sloped armor provided protection that Japanese weapons simply could not overcome. Where Japanese tanks struggled with reliability and mechanical problems, the T-34's diesel engine and robust construction ensured high operational readiness. Where Japanese tanks moved slowly and consumed fuel rapidly, the T-34 combined speed with endurance. The comparison was not between good and better, but between obsolete and modern, between a force equipped for the warfare of the 1930s facing an enemy armed for the 1940s. Soviet combined arms doctrine magnified the T-34's inherent advantages. The tanks did not attack alone, but as part of integrated battle groups that included infantry in armored carriers, self-propelled artillery, combat engineers, and dedicated anti-aircraft protection. This integration meant that Soviet tanks faced fewer situations where they were vulnerable to Japanese infantry close assault. When tanks encountered obstacles or strong points, engineers were immediately available to clear paths or reduce fortifications. When tanks needed to consolidate gains, infantry was present to secure ground and prevent infiltration. The entire system worked together in ways that Japanese forces, organized along more traditional lines with less emphasis on combined arms coordination, could not match. The logistical capabilities supporting the Soviet offensive were themselves remarkable. Moving more than 1 million Soviet troops and all their equipment into position for the Manchurian operation required months of preparation and the use of the Trans-Siberian Railway at maximum capacity. Building supply dumps, positioning ammunition and fuel, establishing maintenance facilities, creating the infrastructure to support mechanized operations across vast distances, demonstrated organizational competence at a strategic level. This logistical foundation meant that advancing Soviet units did not outrun their supplies, that damaged tanks could be repaired, that ammunition remained available, that the offensive could maintain its tempo. Japanese forces, by contrast, struggled with supply problems that left frontline units short of ammunition, fuel, and basic necessities. Even if Japanese weapons had been more effective, shortages would have limited their employment. The human cost of the campaign fell disproportionately on Japanese forces. Soviet casualties were significant but manageable given the scale of forces committed. Japanese casualties included tens of thousands killed and many more captured. Entire divisions simply disintegrated under the Soviet onslaught. Soldiers who survived did so often by surrendering or fleeing rather than through successful defense. The survivors carried memories of helplessness, of facing an enemy they could not hurt, of seeing their positions obliterated by weapons against which they had no effective defense. These memories would shape Japanese understanding of the war's final days and contribute to the recognition that continued resistance against such power was pointless. The strategic implications of the Manchurian operation extended beyond the immediate military results. The speed and decisiveness of the Soviet victory demonstrated to Japanese leaders that the Soviet Union posed a threat that Japan could not counter. Any hope that the Soviet Union might mediate a negotiated peace between Japan and the Western Allies evaporated. The destruction of the Kwantung Army removed the last major Japanese military force that might have been used to defend the home islands. The Soviet entry into the war, and its immediate success, added urgency to Japanese deliberations about accepting the Potsdam Declaration and surrendering. While the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki rightfully receive attention as factors in Japan's decision to surrender, The Soviet offensive in Manchuria was arguably equally significant in convincing Japanese leaders that the war was irretrievably lost. The T-34's performance in Manchuria represented the culmination of its evolution as a weapon system. From its introduction in 1940, through the desperate defensive battles of 1941 and 42, through the turning point at Stalingrad and the offensive operations that followed, the T-34 had been tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable. By 1945, the tank's strengths and limitations were thoroughly understood. Tactics for its employment had been refined through bitter experience. Crew training had been systematized and improved. Production techniques had been optimized. Maintenance procedures had been developed. The machine that rolled into Manchuria was not just a good design, but a mature weapon system operated by an experienced military organization that understood how to employ it effectively. The legacy of the T-34 extended far beyond the specific campaign in Manchuria. The tank's design influenced armor development worldwide. The concept of sloped armor became standard in subsequent tank designs. The emphasis on producibility and maintainability informed thinking about weapons acquisition. The balance between firepower, protection, and mobility that the T-34 achieved became the benchmark against which other designs were measured. Soviet success with the T-34 validated approaches to armor warfare that other nations studied and in some cases adopted. The tank remained in production and in service long after the Second World War ended, seeing action in numerous conflicts and serving with dozens of armies around the world. Few weapons systems have had such lasting impact or such widespread influence. For Japanese defenders in Manchuria, the T-34 represented something more than just a superior weapon. It embodied the modern industrialized warfare that Japan had proven unable to match. The tank was a symbol of the material and organizational superiority that the Soviet Union had developed through the terrible crucible of the Eastern Front. Facing the T-34, Japanese soldiers confronted the reality that courage and determination, while admirable, were insufficient against enemies who possessed not just better weapons but better systems for employing those weapons, better logistics for sustaining operations, better doctrine for coordinating different military capabilities. The T-34 was not just a tank, but the visible expression of a more advanced way of war. The stories that emerged from the Manchurian campaign included numerous accounts of Japanese soldiers who simply could not believe what they were seeing. Veterans of years of fighting in China, accustomed to their own armor dominating battlefields, found themselves facing tanks that their weapons could not hurt. Gunners who had trained extensively and prided themselves on their marksmanship experienced the frustration of achieving clean hits that accomplished nothing. Officers who had planned defensive operations based on assumptions about Soviet capabilities discovered that those assumptions were catastrophically wrong. The psychological shock of this realization, the moment when defenders understood that their positions could not hold, that their weapons were inadequate, that the enemy would break through regardless of their efforts, marked many participants deeply. In the broader narrative of the Second World War's ending, the Manchurian operation and the performance of the T-34 within that operation deserve greater recognition than they typically receive. The campaign demonstrated definitively that Japan faced enemies on multiple fronts with capabilities that exceeded anything Japan could counter. The technical superiority of the T-34 over Japanese armor was symptomatic of broader disparities in industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and military effectiveness. The speed with which Soviet forces overran Manchuria made clear that Japan's strategic position was hopeless and that surrender was not just preferable but inevitable. The T-34 medium tank stands as one of the most successful weapon systems of the Second World War, and its performance in Manchuria provided a final demonstration of its capabilities. The combination of firepower, protection, and mobility that made the tank effective against German panzers proved even more devastating against Japanese forces, who lacked equivalent armor or adequate anti-tank weapons. The operational and tactical doctrines that the Red Army had developed for employing armor were validated once again. The industrial capacity that allowed the Soviet Union to produce thousands of T-34 seconds and support their operations across vast distances proved decisive. For Japanese defenders who faced this onslaught, the experience was one of helplessness against overwhelming force, a fitting if terrible conclusion to a war that Japan had initiated with such confidence and was ending in utter defeat.